Hello and welcome to the City of London Corporation's Apprenticeship webinars. I'm Claire Tunley, the Head of Employability at the City of London Corporation. Since the levy was introduced back in 2017, we've supported a number of businesses in the city to understand how apprenticeships work, how to make the apprenticeships work for their business. The process can seem a little bit complex and confusing, particularly if you're a smaller business and you might not have a great HR team to engage with the process. But if you're paying the levy and you really want to use your investment, these webinars are for you. To help businesses understand the process, we've designed a series of 8 videos to dismantle some of the complexity around apprenticeships and simplify the steps involved in taking on an apprentice. We're covering a range of topics, including the apprenticeship levy, stakeholder engagement, training providers and endpoint assessors, and how to recruit. Whilst all the information that we cover is accurate and complete today, please do refer to the Government Apprenticeship website for the most recent information, as things can change. Today I'm joined by Peter Pledger, the CEO of the National Skills Academy for Financial Services. He's going to take us through some of the things to think about when matching jobs to the apprenticeship standards and also the training processes that are involved. We've already learnt that apprenticeships are jobs that include an element of formal training, but we know that when thinking about taking on an apprentice, starting by thinking about the job that needs doing rather than the standards or the levy is really the right way to go. Is that right, Peter?
Yes, Claire, it's absolutely correct. Many employers get themselves tied into knots by trying to work out how to make the system work, trying to squeeze round pegs into square holes. The starting point for every employer should be the same. What do they need as a business? What actually will help them grow their business and sustain their business? And therefore, when they are considering an apprentice, the first question is, what job do I actually need to be done? What skills do I need the individual who gets that job to have? Then the process is to move to the standards that are available.
Just a quick point on wages and apprenticeships. There is a national minimum wage for apprentices, which is different to the national minimum wage for ordinary employees. So businesses will want to ensure they're within the minimum wage legislation. Do check online because the amount does change on a regular basis. Many businesses are supporters and guaranteed to pay the London Living Wage, and many businesses might want to consider this for their apprenticeship programme. So once we've found a job role and we've identified that we've got a vacancy or something we need to train somebody in, what do we do next? Where do we start?
Well, the next stage is to look at the standards that have been approved. There are many hundreds of them, and they are all listed on the government website we've mentioned earlier. The standards are not complicated documents. Every standard is on approximately 2 sides of A4, outlining the job that they cover and the skills, knowledge and behaviour that the individual that follows the standards will acquire. Now, some employers will say, well, how is it possible for this standard to meet the needs of their particular business? Well, if you go through the words outlined in each, in fact, almost every single standard, the words are extremely flexible. It outlines the general area that the standard is for and outlines the skills and the knowledge and behaviour that the individual will acquire. It is not prescriptive on the type of work that individual will do. The employee should avoid getting too concerned about the job title. It is clearly not possible to have a standard that will cover the many different variations of job titles in each sector. So the job titles are quite generic job titles. So don't get concerned about that. But look at the terms described within the standard and see whether or not they are able to be adapted to meet your needs. In most cases, the terms are very flexible and very open to adaptation.
And I think some of the other places that we can go for advice on trying to find a standard to match the job role that we've got is maybe talk to some of our professional bodies or even training providers. Many training providers that I know companies in financial services already work with also provide apprenticeship training, so they might be a good source of advice and guidance.
Absolutely. There's no shortage of actually good sources of advice and guidance. Training providers, professional bodies, other employers involved in the sector. So you can get advice from a whole range of areas. But I would also recommend that every employer actually reads the standards themselves. They're freely available, and you can see just by a cursory glance that they can be adapted to meet most needs. One example is the standard that's for compliance and risk officers. That level 3 standard lays out very clearly what skills, knowledge and behaviour is required, lays out the duration, 15 to 18 months, and even lays out the professional qualifications that an employer can pick for the apprentice, which will give them the professional qualification needed to do the job. I'd be very surprised if there are many financial services companies who wouldn't be able to adapt that to meet their needs for compliance officers at this time.
Thank you, Peter. We can see the standard that's been published as of today on compliance and risk officer that sets out very clearly the knowledge, the skills and the behaviours required, and like you say, the duration, some of the qualifications that the apprentice would have to meet, and also what the level is of the apprenticeship, which is very helpful. And you've just mentioned there's quite a lot of room for manoeuvre in here. So what kind of things can be considered with some flexibility within the standard?
Well, employers need to regard the standard as the point at which the apprentice needs to get to at the end of the apprenticeship, not where they are at the beginning. So that therefore it's entirely within the gift of the employer to work out the details of the curriculum hand in glove with the training provider so that they can reach the standard and meet what is required by the endpoint assessment, which is the way they'll be examined to make sure that they are at the correct standard. So within that, and remember in this particular standard that we're looking at, there's 15 to 18 months worth of training time available. The employer can ask for particular things and additional things to be added to the training. The standard is the minimum required, not the maximum, and therefore employers should be encouraged and are encouraged to make sure that people do have all the skills that they require the individual to have to do the job.
Okay, you've mentioned endpoint assessors there, so we do have another webinar coming up specifically on endpoint assessors if people want to understand more about that part of the process. So you've mentioned that this compliance and risk officer that we're looking at is a level 3 apprenticeship. Can you just explain a little bit more about the different levels? We have a slide here showing some of the comparisons.
Indeed, the levels are there to try and give a guide both to government and to employers about the equivalence of a qualification. So this particular standard at level 3 is the equivalent of an individual getting 2 A-levels. There are standards at level 2, which is equivalent to 5 GCSEs. There are standards at 4, 5 and 6, which is equivalent to the first, second and third year of university. And there are some standards at level 7, which is equivalent to a postgraduate qualification. So as you can see, you can take an apprenticeship at very high levels indeed, all the way up to postgraduate.
Thank you. And this is, just to recap, the level that the apprentice will be at the end of the apprenticeship, not at the beginning.
That's absolutely correct, Claire. The important thing is that the standard sets where the apprentice needs to be when they complete the apprenticeship, not when they start.
So moving on to looking at the training, the 20% off the job training that's required as part of an apprenticeship. How is it structured? It's in my head, it's traditionally the day release, the 1 day a week out of the office. Is that the case now?
No, it's not. There's nothing wrong with day release, and some employers may feel that that's the best system for them. But it's entirely within the gift of the employer working with the training provider. The standard sets the level the apprentice needs to get to at the end of the apprenticeship. The endpoint assessment says how that level will be measured. But there is no set curriculum. It is for the training provider and the employer to work together on the best way to ensure that the apprentice is properly trained. So it could be day release. It could be that the employer decides that all the off-the-job training is done at the beginning. It could be some other combination of off-the-job training. It could involve online learning. There's a whole range of things that employers can do. But the important thing is the employers pick a method that works for them, works for their business, and works for their apprentice.
Does the training have to take place all in the office, or can we ask apprentices to do it somewhere in their own time?
The training can take place away from the office, and it can take place with the apprentice's own time. However, 20% of the off-the-job training must take place in the the apprentice paid time. You remember I said at the outset that an apprenticeship is a job with training, which means that the apprentice is paid, and 20% of that paid time they must be allowed to do training to enable them to acquire the apprenticeship standard.
And how about things such as internal training that we undertake, induction processes, progress reviews, those kinds of things? Do they count towards the 20%?
Well, some induction training could count towards the 20%, but you need to be clear that the apprentice is acquiring new skills or knowledge. Simply giving somebody a health and safety talk is something that every employer would need to undertake anyway, and therefore that would not be counted as contributing to their apprenticeship. But if the induction includes elements of training that does contribute to the skills and knowledge required for the apprenticeship, then it can count towards the 20%.
We've also heard that some businesses might only want to take on one or maybe two apprentices at a time. Does that work for training providers when they might need to fill a classroom or a whole course?
It is a challenge for some training providers, but there's a myth that the employers who are taking on apprentices are taking on dozens of apprentices in any particular sector. There are some employers that do that, but the vast majority of businesses, particularly in financial services, are unable to do that for size or for practical reasons. There is no difficulty in an employer saying that they just want one apprentice. The government wants to encourage every employer to take on at least one, and therefore if employers are willing to do that, they will clearly be in line with government policy on this. However, the work needs to be undertaken to find the right training provider who is able to do that. Some training providers group apprentices together in particular cohorts so that they can train ones and twos from different employers together. Others have different methodologies by which they can deal with this. But no employer should see the fact that they only want one apprentice as a barrier to them taking on an apprentice at all.
And of course, we know that there's many bodies out there who can provide further advice to businesses on an individual basis about the training elements and the standard matching. So, for example, professional bodies, the training providers themselves, sector bodies such as National Skills Academy for Financial Services and others can provide this advice. There may or may not be a charge for this, so you'd have to investigate that yourself. So I just want to say thank you very much to Peter for this webinar. There are some more specific topics that we're going to cover in other webinars. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.